Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First tonight, I'd like to make it clear that in the case of this talk, the mood is not the message. The mood is anguish, but the message is something else. So if you hear anguish, that just means that you're not dead yet. Now, the reason for holding the meeting on Thursday night is that Thursday night traditionally is the night of the resolver of difficulties. This meeting is being held in honor of the resolver of difficulties, which is a way of talking about the operation of divine wisdom and mercy, and in remembrance of all those who still await justice. And as an offering, I would like to read the chapter Ad-Duha from the Quran in English. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. By the forenoon bright and the night when dark and quiet, your Lord has not abandoned you and does not despise you. Surely hereafter is better for you than what was before, and your Lord will surely give to you, and you will be pleased. Did God not find you orphaned and provide you refuge, and find you wandering and guide you, and find you needy and enrich you? So do not oppress the orphan or refuse the one who seeks, and tell of the bounty of your Lord. Now, the overt purpose of addressing the issue of Islam and slavery is because the supposed recognition of slavery in Islam is commonly used in the West as part of the formalized Western hostility toward Islam, trying to suggest that this is the mark of an outdated way of thinking. Now, my purpose is not to preach Islam per se, but common sense. In this case, common sense is that hostility and fear are easy to manipulate, and that means that people are easy to manipulate by means of hostility and fear, and that it's easy to aim hostility and fear at particular targets from outside the domain of those people who are directly involved in that particular hostility and fear. In other words, the people who buy into the formalized Western hostility toward Islam are simply buying into a general program of global destabilization and warmongering. So it's not only unjust to unthinkingly perpetuate hostile stereotypes of any people, large or small. It's also foolish and dangerous. Now, in the case of Islam, since the community of Islam is so large that it comprises about a fifth of humanity, those who mindlessly participate in this sort of bigotry and prejudice are creating a situation, or helping to create a situation, in which the entire earth may be continued to be enslaved in perpetual antagonism and warfare. Now, an ancient Chinese proverb says, if you reconcile bitter enemies in such a way that hostility is sure to remain, how can that be called good? Now, we know that the United States is deeply involved in the Middle East, for example, politically, economically, and militarily. What we have to ask ourselves, I think, if we live here, is how then can a peace process, as they call it, in the Middle East, attain maturity when wealthy and powerful and interested third parties are conditioned to pessimism, are conditioned to bias? For example, in this case, Americans have been trained to believe that Muslims and Jews are born in perpetual conflict and doomed to perpetual conflict. The historical fact is, of course, that most real oppression of the Jews has been at the hands of Christians, not Muslims at all. And in fact, Muslims and Jews have cooperated for centuries and centuries, as is well known, for example, in the case of Muslim Spain of the Middle Ages. However, the image of irresolvable antagonism between the Muslim and the Jew is the one that is promoted in this country. So we have to ask ourselves, is this really a sincere attempt at peace when we're being taught that peace is really not possible? So if we're interested in peace, I think the first thing we need to do is not rely entirely on negotiators, but personally not buy into these hostilities and not buy into the belief that they are necessary, inherent, or permanent. Now, on another front, we can observe how the American public is today being sold on the idea of developing Russia and China economically. This year, however, these last few years, the Americans are not also reminded that material prosperity in Russia and China have historically always led to expansionism. That somehow is no longer considered at issue as far as the public is concerned. However, there happens to be an ocean of Muslims between Moscow and Beijing. And I don't think that Americans are well aware of the possibilities that building up Russia and China simply in economic terms, material terms, may lead to serious conflicts in Central Asia as, for example, the Russians or some militaristic elements in Russia may decide that they, after all, do want the Soviet Union back and want to retake Central Asia, or if some military elements in China, and I might remind you that one of the largest investment groups in China is the Red Army, a communist country, but the biggest capitalist is the army. That's something to think about. Chinese have always traditionally marched on Central Asia when they have reunited their own heartland. Now, the point I'm trying to make is this. If America is conditioned to habitually despise Muslim peoples and habitually disregard the rights of human peoples, then where will be the moral compunction to object to the manufacture and sale of arms for local warfare in Central Asia? Supposedly, the reason that the peace dividend, a now defunct word, that was supposed to come after the end of the Cold War, well, it didn't come because somehow they felt it was impossible to beat their swords into plowshares. Well, if we're taught to think only in economic terms, and we find that weaponry produces lots of jobs and lots of income, then I think a lot of people here are not going to really care about those against whom that weaponry is used, especially if it's people that they've been traditionally taught to disregard and despise. And let me point out that the world market share of weaponry, the America's share of the world market has gone up from 25% to about 60% in this generation. So I'm not talking about science fiction here when I'm talking about the possibility of lots of widespread, if somewhat limited, war, which is exactly what militarists want. We have to distinguish between warriorship and militarism. Warriorship means protecting the home and family, and the land, and the womenfolk, and the children. Militarism is business. It's making money off of the suffering of other people. Now, if we're taught to think that those other people don't count, and all that counts is us having jobs and income, well, we could be heading for hell thinking that we're going to paradise. I would like to say further, though, however, that I think personally, and I base this on years of experience working in several religious traditions in this country, that formalized hostility toward Islam in America is not just toward Islam. I don't think it is a question of one religion against another. I think it is really hostility toward all religion, the spirit of religion itself. It's really secular materialism against the spirit and soul of religion. I think that Islam just happens to come in for extra heat, partly because of the historical relations, but also because of the piety of the Muslim people who pray 5 times a day. This is something that secular Americans find extraordinary in terms of piety. And the idea that God is really in your life, not just on Sundays, but 7 days a week, well, that's threatening. That is threatening to those who wish us to be nothing but consumers of material goods. Okay, that having been said, let me turn to the subject of legalized slavery itself. And the first thing I think we have to do is distinguish between 2 very different forms of human bondage that have been both labeled as slavery. One is what historians call domestic slavery, which was a product of war, a way of reintegrating captives into society. Then there is chattel slavery. Chattel means possession. Chattel slavery is a completely different phenomenon. In domestic slavery, the individual slave is not deprived of all human rights. The individual slave is no less a human being. And as a rule, in domestic slavery, it is possible for the slave to work for freedom and betterment of his or her condition almost from the beginning. It's not technically necessarily a condition of permanent servitude. Now, this type of slavery was what was practiced in old Africa and old Arabia. Now, chattel slavery, which is totally different, deprives the human of all human rights. The slave is considered property. It's not a human being anymore. This is the type of slavery that was practiced in old Greece, ancient Greece, Rome, and Mesopotamia, which are considered the roots of Western civilization. And this is the type of slavery that was practiced in the United States of America. So when people talk about slavery being recognized in Islam, that does not refer to the type of slavery that was practiced in the United States of America. In the terms of Islam, the slavery that was practiced here in the United States of America was illegal, an abomination, an atrocity. Now, I'd like to look at some of the laws and customs associated with slavery in Islam that will illustrate the tremendous difference between slavery as understood in Islam and chattel slavery as was practiced in this country. In reference to the process of enslavement, there is a sacred saying that on the day of resurrection, God will be the enemy, God will be the opponent of anyone who enslaves a free individual and consumes the profit, or anyone who hires workers and has work done but doesn't pay them. So, while domestic slavery was recognized to the extent that it existed, laws were made designed to integrate slaves into society. Chattel slavery, the laws were designed to segregate, to separate the The slaves were not members of society. They were just like machines. So the whole process of enslavement itself, enslavement is actually illegal in Islam. For profit, that is. Now, freeing slaves is highly recommended, both in the Quran and in the sayings of the Prophet, upon whom be peace. In the Quran, freeing slaves and feeding the hungry are referred to as the high road. And freeing slaves is recommended as expiation for a number of misdeeds, like taking an oath in vain. There was also a special custom of freeing slaves on the occasion of solar and lunar eclipses. And freeing slaves is one of the specifically designated purposes of both the welfare tax, the legal welfare tax, and the and voluntary charity. Then again, if there was a jointly owned slave and one owner freed his part of the slave, that former owner was also expected, if he could afford it, to buy out the other owner to completely free the slave. Or if he couldn't afford it, he was supposed to help the ex-slave find work, extra work, to buy out his own freedom, without, however, overworking him. And that is specified, without overworking him. And this kind of stuff that happened here, like whipping and all that, is completely, it's illegal in Islam. Now, to compare the legal situation briefly in the United States of America, of course, those were the days of states' rights, so there were lots of individual differences. But we can get some indication from these examples. In the year 1801, quite late in the history of this institution, a law was passed in the state of Georgia making it illegal to free a slave without previous consent of the legislature. In 1818, it was even made illegal to give effect to a last will and testament, freeing a slave or allowing a slave to work on his own account. Between about 1830 and 1850, which was not long before the end of legalized slavery, and when abolitionism was gathering steam in America, there was a widespread movement throughout the slave states to prevent slaves from acquiring technical skills, which they had been doing. In other words, to prevent them from getting skills which would enable them to get extra work, to make extra money, to better their lot, and sometimes even buy freedom for their families. So what is encouraged in Islam is prohibited, was prohibited here in America. The abolitionists, by the way, who were Christian people and thought instinctively that something was wrong about this, had an awful hard time because they couldn't find anything in the Bible that really made it quite clear once they hadn't recognized that these were people. They didn't know quite what to say. They knew it was wrong, but they didn't quite know why in terms of their Bible. Now, if they had had more information about Islam and had seen the policies of Islam regarding slavery, it could have given them a lot of good ideas for having cleaned up much better after a very bad mistake. Now, regarding treatment of slaves, to begin with, there's an interesting expression in the Quran describing slaves, captive slaves, as those under the control of your right hand. Now, in Quranic language, the right hand stands for justice and righteousness. So this implies that you are obliged to treat those under the control of your right hand with justice and righteousness. Now, the following injunctions can be found in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. Your slaves are your brothers, whom God has placed under your control. So whoever has his brother under his control should feed and clothe him with what he himself eats and wears. and do not assign him a task that is too much for him. Or if you do, then help him. And he also said, when your servant brings you your meal, if you do not invite him to sit with you, at least have him take some of the food for himself. For he is the one who suffered the heat of the stove and took pains to prepare it. In addition, education of slaves and intermarriage with slaves are also recommended within the general provisions for marriage. Because Islam did not create an ideology of racism or ethnic prejudice, there was not, well, indeed the very opposite, in fact. There was not this stigma attached to slavehood. And an enslaved person was still a person, and not less of a human being. This, I believe, is the sense of the saying, whom God has placed under your control. In other words, it's not, you're not entitled to exercise your arbitrary whims. Now, the understanding that we find in Islam and this practice were not characteristic, obviously, of chattel slavery. And if we extrapolate over centuries, if we draw out over centuries these two different policies, the one being discriminative and the other being integrative, we can see that they produce very different consequences in society and psychologies. Now, the issue of slavery, and particularly chattel slavery, I'm also using as an entryway into consideration of dehumanization in general, and how it can happen in a number of different ways. In the case of chattel slavery, I'd like to focus on three factors which made it possible for this to happen. Three factors which I believe are not in the ordinary historical consciousness of America. And I think they should be, because very similar things continue to happen, and they do also continue to create compromising situations, if not legally formalized, as happened in the days of slavery. The first thing is the destruction of the old trade between Africa and the Middle East and South Asia. This is one of the things that the Portuguese did quite early on in their relations with Africa. I don't know whether this was just a stupid blunder or whether it was actually a tactic, because it could have been either. However, it can be observed that breaking alliances, which is one of the effects of destroying this trade, is a classical tactic of warfare, both military and non-military warfare. So maybe they did it on purpose, or maybe they were just greedy. They certainly did not understand the Quranic injunction to trade among yourselves out of mutual consent. The Portuguese did not understand world trade. Okay, well, besides ruining alliances, the destruction of this old trade also depressed the urban economy of coastal Africa, the urban economies, several economies of coastal Africa, which therefore led to an increased emphasis on slaving for pure economic reasons. Prior to that, the trade in slaves had been very small. Now, the second factor has to do with conflicts within Africa. European slaving nations deliberately intensified these conflicts within Africa in order, one, to increase gun sales, and two, to increase the number of captives available for slavery, because the African peoples would not enslave their own. Then the third factor is the development of racist pseudo-scholarship This was created and elaborated between about 1650 and 1850. Although, unfortunately, we can see that it still goes on today under the auspices of a group of individuals we may refer to as scholars for dollars. Well, they can do a lot of harm, you see, sitting in their ivory towers spreading a lot of lies. And you know, we sure do put a lot of onus and burden on primary and secondary school teachers to take up the slack for a failing society and disintegrating family structure. But what about upper education? What about the scholars for dollars who in their offices write this kind of stuff without any conscience, without thinking of how it's going to affect other people, because they've got their chairs, they've got their grants, whatever it is. So I think we should be a little more demanding up there rather than expect the poor teachers in primary school and secondary school to make up for all the craziness that goes on. Okay, anyway, I think that these factors are all very significant today because we can still see isolation, division, and traffic in weaponry for profit still retarding human liberty and progress internationally as well as within nations. And I think also the third factor, that is the deliberate creation of racist theory and ideology, is particularly significant today, partly because it does still go on. I think we need to observe it, because by doing so, by observing this activity, we can debunk certain myths, certain suggestions that are now presently being used to further the persecution of people who have already been victimized by racist ideology. And these myths, or these suggestions I refer to, are, one, that racism is intrinsic human nature, and two, that racism is the cause of oppression. Now, I submit that these myths, or I call them suggestions, are purposely promoting despair. Purposely promoting despair. And I also suggest that both sacred revelation and actual history, when studied in depth, that is outside of a limited, bigoted American curriculum, do indeed show that racism is an acquired habit rather than basic nature, and that racism is a manufactured tool of oppression rather than an inherent cause of oppression. Now, as far as sacred revelation is concerned, I'll turn to the Quran. In the chapter of Rome says, "Among the signs of God is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your complexions. Surely in that is a sign for the knowing." And the chapter Cattle says, "It is God who has produced you all from a single self." And the chapter The Apartment says, "O humanity, we created you from a male and a female, and made you into races and tribes for you to know each other." It doesn't say for you to rip each other off. It says for you to know each other. And the chapter Luqman says, "Do not avert your face from people in arrogance or contempt, nor walk haughtily on the earth, for God loves no conceited braggart." Now, I like to use these sayings for parameters for historical studies as well as for psychological studies. We can see that people who followed these recommendations did prosper, especially culturally, but also economically. Whereas those who enriched themselves materially in defiance of these principles, always inevitably created the seeds of their own destruction. Now let me turn to a historical example that disproves the race or color theory. And this can be found in the English occupation of Ireland, which continued for 8 centuries and decimated the Irish population by enslavement, massacre, and systematic starvation. Now, for political reasons, this story is not told here in the United States. It's not in your history books. And even the contemporary situation is misrepresented. They say that the current Irish rebellion is, what do they say? It's a conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants. Religious war, you see. Actually, it's an Irish rebellion against 800 years of English occupation. The Irish feel that the English, having been there for 800 years, it's about time they should go home. The English feel, well, we've been here for 800 years, we might as well stay. And see, the religious difference was just used as a weapon. You know, it's not really that the religions they're not fighting each other. That's not it. Now, so because the real story of this is suppressed, you'd really be surprised. It is blanked out remarkably well. I would like to look, instead of regaling you with the gore of this particular story, I'd like to look at a particular case that will show how this actually affects a much wider group of people than just those directly involved in the conflict. This is an example of a famous Irish writer, Samuel Beckett. I think a lot of people have heard of Beckett. He died not too long ago. He's perhaps best known for his play Waiting for Godot, which has been performed all over the world. Now, we can first get some sense of the distortion of history. When we look him up in the encyclopedia, we find that this Irish writer was an Anglo-French writer who was born in Dublin. Well, the reason for that, I think, is because when he was born in 1906, there was no Irish Free State, and there hadn't been for 700 years. Well, the reality is, of course, he left Ireland because he couldn't stand the conditions in occupied Ireland, and he wrote in French as a protest against English imperialism. Anyway, what I object to is this. Waiting for Godot, which is, as I say, is probably his most famous work and played all over the world, is about people waiting for redemption, waiting for deliverance, so long that they have even forgotten what it is. All that they know is that they are waiting. Well, unfortunately, this was seized upon by secular nihilist intellectuals on the continent, and they raised this poor fellow into the position of the father of the theater of the absurd, and tried to make him a champion of absurdism, which tried to present mankind as having been abandoned by God. Well, as a matter of fact, the reason for this misinterpretation is that the real cultural background is not understood if you consider this man an Anglo-French writer. The reality is that Waiting for Godot reflects the Irish history of having been abandoned by the world, beginning with the Christian world, for 800 years with no end in sight. And, more importantly, it reflects Irish mysticism, the Irish faith beyond hope, waiting even until the end of time for deliverance, which only God can deliver. This is the meaning of Waiting for Godot. Now, because of secular ideology and suppression of one particular cultural background, all in the world who have been reading and seeing Samuel Beckett have been robbed, have been deprived of the spiritual message of faith beyond hope, of perpetual attendance upon the mercy of God. Instead, the message has been interpreted as the opposite. It's not those who are waiting for God who are absurd. It's those who have given up on God. Those are the ones who are absurd. Now, if we can't pin brutality on racism, then what is the cause? Well, the Quran says, competing for more and more distracts you until you go to the tombs. Distracts us from what? From our real nature, from our real potential. In this case, in this particular case, the destruction of Ireland, actually it wasn't, the British didn't start this, by the way. It was actually part of the Western Christian attack on Islam, strangely enough. You see, 1,000 years ago, Ireland had its own Christianity, which was mystical Christianity. And they were not against Islam, as we can see from their art and their theology. And you can even see on Irish crosses, the Bismillah, in Arabic. Well, if you imagine Europe of 1,000 years ago, Ireland up here and Rome down here and there's France in between, and Irish mysticism catching on the continent, the Pope of Rome was worried about being outflanked. So he convinced the Anglo-Norman kings of England to invade Ireland and subjugate it. And so they did. And then, you know, it just became a habit, so they continued for 8 centuries after that. They forgot why they were doing it. Anyway, well, that's secret history. What I'm not trying to focus on Anglo-Irish relations particularly, but what I want to show is how race or color difference is not the essential ingredient. I mean, the English and the Irish are both pale as moonlight. You can't pin that on color. What we can also see is how such a history can be concealed so thoroughly behind very, very flimsy stereotypes. And in a country where 60% of the people have Irish blood, almost none of them have any idea of how really they got to be here. Everybody thinks it was because of the starvation during the potato famines. Nobody knows that during those years, the Irish were not just planting potatoes. They had bumper crops of wheat, but the English took it all, and they left the Irish to starve. But it was the potato famines. Anyway, generally speaking, what I mean to say, it's not just the history of ethnic minorities in this country that are systematically suppressed or distorted. There are quite a few histories of European peoples that are also systematically suppressed and distorted in the mainstream. And one effect of this, whether this is a deliberate effect or a side effect, I'm not going to judge, but one effect for sure is to cause a lot of historically conditioned resentment to be misdirected and therefore futile, thus further injuring the resenter and the resentee, allowing the real culprit to be. Now, this is a classic art of war. This is classic strategy. And I might point out that this is the real reason, the underlying reason why I've translated so much material on tactical science and strategic science to help people to see this kind of thing going on in everyday life, to see it more clearly, to understand it, and therefore to be able to take steps to become immune to it and not become infected by this sort of delusive thinking. Now, to zero in on the real roots of human oppression, therefore, we have to look at the factors that rob people of their basic humanity, their basic sensibility. And this brings us back to religion and the Islamic view of human depravity. In particular, the concepts of the devil and the false Messiah. Now, the devil and the false Messiah might be said to represent the essence of enslavement, the things that lead to mental and material slavery. Now, I've noticed everybody in this room stayed calm, but it's usually when you use terms like devil and false Messiah, people react in a very perturbed or hostile manner, actually, as if, it would seem, they are accustomed to the use of these terms to arouse anxiety and fear and even hysteria. So, to avoid this, I want to approach these concepts in a somewhat different way. Let me begin by citing the words of a modern Muslim scholar, Sayyid Iqbal Ali Shah, on the notion of invitation to evil. And I quote, "Just as our physical faculties are not by themselves sufficient to enable us to attain any object in the physical world without the assistance of other agents, so our own spiritual powers cannot by themselves lead us to do good or evil deeds. But here too, intermediaries which have an existence independent of our eternal spiritual powers are necessary to enable us to do good or evil deeds." In other words, continuing the quotation, there are two attractions placed in the nature of man: the attraction to good, or to rise up to higher spheres of virtue, and the attraction to evil, or to stoop down to a kind of low, bestial life. But to bring these attractions into operation, external agencies are needed, as they are needed in the case of the physical powers of man. The external agency which brings the attraction to good into work is called an angel, and that which assists in the working of the attraction to evil is called the devil. The proposition of the existence of the devils is as true as that of the existence of the angels, but while the Quran requires a belief in angels, it does not require a belief in the devils. If belief in angels were only an equivalent to an admission of their existence, a belief in devils would be an equal necessity. But it is not so. The reason is that whereas we are required to accept and follow the call of the inviter to good, we are not required to follow the call of the inviter to evil. And therefore, as the former gives us a basis for action, which the latter does not, we believe in the angels, but not in the devils. Sounds good to me. Now, in Buddhist terms, that was the end of the quote. In Buddhist terms, the phenomenon whose existence is recognized but not believed in is called an existing illusion. When you believe in it and act on it, it's no longer illusion, it's delusion. And that's the beginning of bondage and misery. So, this is why I believe the Prophet Muhammad said, may peace be upon him, God disregards any evil suggestion that occurs to people as long as it is not spoken of or acted upon. But what if we don't recognize the invitation to evil as suggestion? What if we think it's our own thoughts? So, passive disbelief isn't quite enough of a guarantee against invitation to evil if we don't recognize invitation to evil for what it is, if we think it's our own thoughts, in other words. So, we have to see the truth of it. As the Quran says, God hurls the truth at falsehood, and the truth breaks its head. We have to break the head of falsehood to be really free. And to do so, to see the truth of falsehood, that it is false. Now let me look at the concept of the devil. In the Quran, the archetype of the Satan or the devil is a fallen angel. When God was going to create the human as a vice-regent on earth, the angels got all upset and they protested to God, oh, there's going to be trouble. God said, I know better than you, and made the human, and then commanded all the angels to bow to the human. And they all did except one, which was Iblis. Now, Iblis, then the angel Iblis is ejected from the presence of God. And in revenge, vows to spend the rest of time trying to prove the human corrupt, vowing to come upon the human in their faces and at their backs and to their right and to their left, and to prove that they're only clay and they're corrupt. Now, what I think is most significant is the name of that angel, Iblis, is traditionally said to derive from the verb ablasa, which means he despaired. So despair is the essence of the devil. Despair, particularly despair of the higher nature of man, despair of higher potential. So that's why I think that the notion that particularly racism is inherent, that is the devil. That's despair. That is despair. That is devilish suggestion. Now, turning to the false Messiah, the Antichrist, or the lying Messiah, one of my favorite names. The Arabic term for this is ad-Dajjal, which literally means to cover the whole camel with pitch. And it comes from this. Pitch, or tar, was used as an ointment, an unguent for mange. Now, the name of the Antichrist, covering the whole camel with pitch, means you're covering up the whole thing. A total deception. Covering up all the mange, particularly. Now, so it means deception or falsehood. That is the essence of the false Messiah. Now, because the operation of the false Messiah also makes use of suggestion, that is, suggesting falsehoods to cover up truth, I personally refer to the Dajjal as the pitchman, which in colloquial English means someone who tries to get you to buy something you don't need. And again, in colloquial English, to buy means to believe. I think that's quite revealing. Okay. Now, according to a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, the pitchman, or the lying Messiah, has only one eye and brings semblances of paradise and hell, casting the image of paradise on what is actually hell. Now, that one eye, this quality of having one eye, might be taken, I think, to refer to total materialism. See, like the image of human being as only clay, which is what brought the angel down. Sometimes I also think of the one eye as the television screen, which does bring false semblances, doesn't it? False hopes. So, well, I wouldn't necessarily say that was the pitchman itself, but the pitchman most definitely does use that one eye. And even this interactive stuff, I mean, still the program is there. You can't, there's only so much you can do. Anyway, and there again, I think that itself is an unrealistic aim. That itself, this virtual reality idea that we can create an electronic reality that will satisfy us as human beings. Now, I think there is an image of paradise that's really hell. But we'll see. Now, I'd like to take a couple of examples of what I would refer to as one-eyed attitudes and false images of paradise covering hell, using the phenomenon of spiritual alienation of labor, thus to also clarify the connections between deception, cultural robbery, and enslavement of mind and body. First, I would like to quote a statement of a craftsman, a Moroccan craftsman, which is retold by the great Swiss scholar Titus Burckhardt in his remarkable book, Fez, City of Islam. This comb maker is what he was. This craftsman made combs out of horn. And he's lamenting the disappearance of authentic crafts in face of cheap, mass-produced products. I quote, "It is not only a pity that today, solely on account of price, poor quality combs from a factory are being preferred to much more durable horn combs," he said. "It is also senseless that people should stand by a machine and mindlessly repeat the same movement, while an old craft like mine falls into oblivion. My work may seem crude to you, but it harbors a subtle meaning which cannot be explained in words. I myself acquired it only after many long years, and even if I wanted to, I could not automatically pass it on to my son if he himself did not wish to acquire it. And I think he would rather take up another occupation." This craft can be traced back from apprentice to master until one reaches our Lord Seth, the son of Adam. It was he who first taught it to men, and what a prophet brings, for Seth was a prophet, must clearly have a special purpose, both outwardly and inwardly. I gradually came to understand that there is nothing fortuitous about this craft, that each movement and each procedure is the bearer of an element of wisdom. But not everyone can understand this. But even if one does not know this, it is still stupid and reprehensible to rob men of the inheritance of prophets and to put them in front of a machine where day in and day out they must perform a meaningless task. Unquote. Now, I don't want to give the impression I'm a Luddite or one of those who is against machinery. What I am objecting to is servility to machines. So to make it clear what I'm talking about, let me rephrase this last statement. Even if one does not know that traditional crafts also have an inward function as well as an outward function, namely to concentrate and transmit elements of wisdom, even if one does not know this, it is still stupid and reprehensible to rob men of the inheritance of prophets and to put them in front of a machine where day in and day out they must perform a meaningless task for only money, which itself has no intrinsic value, which can be manipulated and is manipulated day in and day out, outside of our control. Are we expected to buy with that money all of the satisfaction that we miss on the job? Is that right? Well, where do we buy that? I think, frankly, the spiritual alienation of work is one of the worst diseases of our time. And disdain for the work of the hands is, frankly, one of the most demented aspects of our culture. I use the word culture advisedly. Part of the prophetic inheritance in work is the attitude of work, as indicated by the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. No one eats better food than that earned by the work of his own hands. Indeed, God's prophet David, peace be upon him, used to eat from the labor of his own hands. Now, I'd like to turn to American folklore to show how this principle, this honor for work, is demeaned in America, and how cultural instruments can be current and yet drained of all authentic meaning, and even perverted to uses thoroughly at variance with their original intention. For this, I'd like to use the well-known story of John Henry. This is one of the best-known stories in American folklore. Briefly stated, John Henry was a laborer who challenged a newly developed machine. The machine was supposed to be able to do the work of 6 men. John Henry challenged it. He beat the machine, but he died of a heart attack. Now, I first heard this story in the 1950s as a schoolboy. And we were told by the classroom teacher that the meaning of the story is that you can't fight progress. This was the 1950s. Defy the machine and you die, even if you win. No, I think that's cruel to tell this to children, and I never forgot it either, as you can see. Anyway, the problem, one of the main, actually there's several problems, I don't have time to go into all of them, but the main problem with the standard versions of this story is that they neglect to include that critical line spoken by the bosses when they brought in the machine, without which it is impossible to understand the true purport of the story. Now, the books they make for children say, the bosses bring in the machine and say, oh, John Henry, look at this wonderful machine. It can do the work of 6 men. And then John Henry says, oh, yeah, and he challenges it out of pride. Well, we all know that what really happened when the bosses brought the machine, they said, hey, John Henry, look at this machine. It can do this work of 6 men. You're fired. And you. That's what really happened. And John Henry challenged the machine to save jobs. Now, the image of mechanization, automation, as the harbinger of wealth and leisure, unbounded, which has in fact been force-fed to the American people since childhood, has been, frankly speaking, for many a working person, an image of paradise that was really hell. Even though John Henry is portrayed as a hero, the meaning of his challenge to the machine as an attempt to save imperiled jobs has been drained out of the story in the process of adoption into the mainstream. Even in recent versions where John Henry is more of an ethnic hero, his heroism is still portrayed as individualistic and not connected to the redemption of his people. But if we consider the fact, however, that the original John Henry was an ex-slave, a man who had just gotten out of slavery, now facing unemployment, you mean to tell me he challenges the machine out of pride? This is awfully cheap coin, but it is precisely the coin that we're being taught to accept as real value. Even culture itself, the idea that culture is for pride, a sense of pride, that's ridiculous. Culture is to develop the human being. Yes, it may make your parents proud of you, or your children proud of you, but being proud of yourself is not part of culture. Now, as a matter of fact, when we look at the real historical and cultural context of the John Henry legend, we realize, in fact, it's originally a Christian morality play. It's a story of redemption, of self-sacrifice, of sacrificing oneself for others. John Henry went to his death so that others might have jobs. The machine, which sadly does prevail in the world of matter, even though John Henry is victorious in the realm of spirit, represents the monster of the Roman Empire, the domain of the Caesar, the manifestation of sheer worldliness, which is represented in the Christian book of Revelations as the monster. Now, to obscure this content and this meaning is not only to misrepresent American history and culture, but it is to rob people of the message of spiritual redemption. And this message of spiritual redemption is what really lies at the core of the story and represents the faith and the longing of enslaved peoples. So the process is still going on. Meaning is still being taken away from us. And what's the substitute? Pride and what? Now, I'd like to conclude this phase of the discussion by bringing up the question of how much freedom we now actually have to question the role of machines, particularly computers and computer networks and virtual reality. Now, we can cite things like the added difficulty of parental supervision when data can be made to disappear at the touch of a button. We can cite the added difficulty of shy adolescents developing healthy social personalities when they are more accustomed to interacting with machines. We can cite the added difficulty of developing a sound conscience when machines can give the sensation of wish fulfillment without any responsibility for consequences. But, however we may think about these particular things, I think what we have to look at most of all is whether we are being induced to regard the computer as some kind of unquestionable savior. A savior which will solve our educational problems, which will guarantee gainful employment and generally usher in an era of high-tech paradise. I wonder if we are in fact constrained from really questioning the true values and necessities of computers, if only because we don't want to appear unfashionable and backward to others, or if only because we simply assume that there's no turning back, as if it is to be taken for granted that we are, in fact, moving forward. Now, for a capping word on this, I would like to again quote Titus Burckhardt, this in his own words, writing about the effects of Western modernism on Muslim society in Morocco. Quote, "Whereas previously men were differentiated only by their culture, the community is all of a sudden split into economically determined classes, end with the cheap products of the factory. A poverty without beauty invades the homes. Ugly, senseless, and comfortless poverty is the most widespread of all modern achievements. Let me repeat that. Ugly, senseless, and comfortless poverty is the most widespread of all modern achievements. I think it's very important to emphasize the words ugly, senseless, and comfortless, the way Burckhardt does here, because material austerity is not necessarily bereft of beauty, meaning, and peace. It's the spiritual deprivation in this mass-produced poverty that adds insult to injury and that makes us prey to despair. And when we're in despair, we're vulnerable to suggestion. So the devil and the false messiah work together. Now, some people today, some of these revisionist scholars for dollars, try to rationalize chattel slavery as the grounds, as necessary economically. They try to rationalize it on the grounds of economic necessity. Well, there was in fact no such necessity. The New World was brimming with riches, and there was no need to exploit them with massive force. The irony is that most people today will condemn chattel slavery for its atrocity, and indeed this condemnation is politically correct, but yet material ambition and acquisitiveness, which are the real reasons and causes for slavery of all kinds, are still conveyed to the American people as worthwhile values. So we're locked, to that extent, in a hypocrisy that we can't even face. We're rushing headlong to our doom by means that have already betrayed our humanity. Under the guise of separation of church and state, secular pseudo-culture has robbed even our folklore of its spiritual underpinnings and taught us to look upon this world itself as our final destination, and to look upon dominion over this world as our final goal, with nothing more to seek than satisfaction of worldly cravings, acting out of worldly fears, and servile worship of the false god of self-esteem. From this moribund idolatry, this pathetic servility, we can be liberated only by understanding ourselves and our world in a more complete way, not the way of the one-eyed, not the way of the pitchman. The question seems to be whether or not we're taught or whether or not we learn to make this world into a prison and to make ourselves into slaves of the world rather than slaves of truth. Let me give some ideas from Islamic teachings, finally, of how we can take control of this question. Here are some words from one of the earliest companions of the Prophet, upon whom be peace. In fact, the world is an abode of truth for one who is truthful with it, and an abode of well-being for one who understands it. It is an abode of riches for one who learns from it, and an abode of counsel for one who takes a warning from it. It is the house of worship for those who love God, the place of prayer of God's angels, the place of descent of God's inspiration, and the place of business of God's friends. Therein is mercy earned, and therein is paradise gained. So who reviles it when it has already announced its departure and declared it will leave? It has announced its own death and that of its people. By its trials it has given them an example of tribulation, and by its pleasures filled them with longing for pleasure. It started out with well-being and created misfortune, awakening desires and fears, causing alarm and alert. So some people revile it on the day of remorse, while others will praise it on the day of resurrection. For the world reminded them, and they bore it in mind, and it spoke to them, and they verified what it said, and it cautioned them, and they took the warning. Now, today's widespread cult of eternal youth and immediate, constant, and perpetual gratification is one that, unfortunately, by its nature, leads us away from foresight, responsibility, conscience, and a mature understanding of what we can actually do on earth. So let me close with another indication from the same companion of the only choice we really have on earth. I quote, "The world is a transitory abode, not a permanent abode. And the people in it are of two sorts. One who sells his soul and ruins it, and one who ransoms his soul and frees it."